This is a video on Module 5, which it will cover demography and housing. In the last two modules, we talked loosely about the role of government in the economy. This module is going to be less directly about the role of government, although we will see that the government may intervene in housing markets, and we'll study what might happen if the government intervenes in housing markets, or how the government might have to intervene in housing markets. So starting off with the demographic change or demographic transformation of the United States, over the past 20 to 30 years plus, really over the past, the entire history of the United States, we've been in a period of demographic change. The demographic change of the past 2 to 3 decades is defined by five crucial features. And the first feature of demographic transition in the last few decades is rapid population growth, especially in metropolitan and micropolitan urban areas, which we would think of as cities, um, also to rural areas as the urban cost of living rises. So overall, large growth of population in the United States. For a long time, that growth was limited mostly to cities, but in the last decade or two has spread into rural areas as well. We have a period of diversification, which means a growth in the percentage Black, Asian, two or more races. Percent Hispanic is defined by the US Census. It turns out that the census breaks down demography into race, Black, Asian, white, two or more races. There's a couple other race categories, and then they have a ethnicity category, Hispanic or non-Hispanic. Regardless, these categories are growing. I do a little bit of work on race and demography in my dissertation. In 1980, US cities were about 83% white on average. As we stand today, US cities on average are something like 64 to 67-ish percent white. Right, so we've seen a very large growth, not in any one particular non-white group, but all non-white groups are growing in the United States compared to white race groups, and this is causing a shift in the demographics, especially in cities. Again, we're seeing much more non-whiteness in cities, and I believe now out of the top 100 most populous cities in the United States, at least 30 are now predominantly non-white. So white is the minority now in about close to 1/3 of the largest US cities. As a result, we are on the track to what scientists call being a majority minority population, which means that we may live to see the time where non-white race groups make up more than 50% of the United States. Right now, I believe that figure is about 33%. Back in 1980, I think it was something like 18 to 20%. Right. Demographics also includes age and aging. We have what we call a baby boomer population, which is now reaching the retirement age. We're also seeing a life expectancy decrease for the first extended time period in US history. Life expectancy was slowly increasing throughout the last couple centuries, but within about the last 10 to 20 years, we seem to have leveled off and actually decreased life expectancy in the United States. We have demographics of education and what we call selective education, inequality along geographic and racial lines. To some degree, we talked a little bit about that in the previous week's discussion on Iowa's policies. And finally, we have the transformation of income. We are seeing you might hear about kind of like the gutting of the middle class, a divided population with about half or more of adults 24 and over living paycheck to paycheck, meaning that they have no savings, or I think this statistic is maybe less than $1,000 of savings. And so there's a very large division growing among those who can own property and cannot own property. As we know, some people own multiple properties and rent them out, while others cannot own any property at all. Right, so the demographic transformation of the United States features these five key features, and we'll talk a little bit more about these features as we go on. Cities, which we call metropolitan and micropolitan urban areas, are at the forefront of demographic change in the United States. The sprawling growth of these urban areas has made many Americans completely reliant on personal automobiles for access to work and household necessities. So, as part of this demographic transformation, the last 30 years plus, as we've seen migration out of city centers towards suburbs, more and more Americans are relying on cars. The number of cars per family has been increasing still over the last few decades. Metro areas responsible for the high percentage of population growth. There are also areas for the fastest minority growth, which we talked about. In 1980, again, cities were on average about 80% white. I think it's might even be closer to about 83 or 84% as of the 1980 census. In the 2010 census, the figure was about 67%. I say today there, but now we have the 2020 census coming out. When the 2020 census results are finalized, I expect this number to be smaller, somewhere maybe around 63, 64% for 2020. So the demographic transition in the United States is going to bring on some benefits and some challenges. As economists, we tend to study a little bit more on the side of the challenges than on the benefits, but there are definitely benefits of demographic change and transition. Larger workforce, tax base, increases the pool of skilled labor, allows for local specialization of labor, perhaps some exchange of cultural knowledge. We expand our cultural awareness. We might figure out ways that other people or cultures have done things. Also, an increased early age to exposure to other races and cultures. Scientists, researchers generally believe that one of the biggest factors in combating race supremacy moving forward is going to be just exposure to these other races and cultures. So as the US becomes more diverse, especially in the rural areas, as the rural areas become less predominantly white, the idea is hopefully we'll have more experience and exposure with other races and cultures combating white supremacy in the United States. Some challenges that come along with demographic change, of course, housing and overcrowding in urban areas. There's definitely an income aspect to that as well. You hear a little bit about the concept of the housing project, and so we might talk a little bit about that. There's actually a great Vice documentary out there about the Chicago public housing projects. Maybe I'll post that a little bit later, but certainly not required. There's a generational divide growing in the cities. In the cities, about 1 in 2 children, in fact, over 1 out of every 2 children under, I think, the age of 10 or 16 is non-white, but less than 1 in 4 elderly or older citizens are non-white, right? So there's, again, this huge generational divide amongst the youngest generation. We're fairly split evenly, racially, white and other race categories, but the oldest citizens are very different. Only about 25% of the oldest generation currently is non-white. So again, this generational divide growing. Many of the older citizens of the United States grew up in a time where the cities, states were predominantly white. As we transition towards demographic change, there's going to be perhaps some sort of generational differences or frictions that appear as we adjust to living in different demographic worlds. Finally, we got some healthcare costs associated with the aging population. Interestingly, we won't do a ton of healthcare stuff in this class, something I'd like to add a little bit more on, but I do believe we have some healthcare economics classes here, maybe a little labor and public economics, especially you would see healthcare stuff. Educational and income inequalities, we've talked about a little bit. The educational inequalities can be divided really neighborhood by neighborhood, with some neighborhoods having very good quality schools and teachers, and neighboring or bordering neighborhoods having very poor quality schools and education. It has an income aspect to which we need to study as economists. All right, so we know as economists, the demography of the United States is changing. As economists, we study the demographics of change. And we mostly in economics focus on kind of what the challenges of demographic change will be into the future. However, we do also want to recognize that demographic change, most economists or scientists believe that demographic change ultimately is good for us. It's just a question of, how do we handle the demographic change moving forward? All right, so I posted this racial dot map, and there's, not a whole lot to take away from this except what many of you already know, which is the demographic distribution of the United States. Right, we see that in the rural areas is still primarily white, although the coastal city area is now becoming perhaps more predominantly Black, Asian, Hispanic, depending on the region. Right, this area in here tends to be more predominantly Hispanic. Down in the southeast and east, you have predominantly Black places. So the reason to keep this in mind is that, I guess election season comes up and you see all of these US maps of election and voting and coverage, things like that. We have to sort of understand that policy in a place, over here, which is much more diverse, racially mixed, the policy opinions are going to be very different than, somewhere over here in Kansas and Nebraska, where you have a low, predominantly white population. All right, so again, just sort of keeping in mind what the distribution of the United States is, and it is something, again, I think we kind of already know and recognize, which are that the politics and the demographics, the kind of schools of thought which occur within cities right now are going to be pretty different than those which occur in rural areas, especially especially with regard to demographics, issues facing people of color. All right, so we'll move on now into housing markets, and we can study in the context of supply and demand the idea of housing prices, perhaps homelessness as well. The supply and demand model provides a simple model for a rental market. We could do the same thing for a purchasing market, but generally we sort of think that people who are renting and people who are purchasing houses are sort of different subsets of people, not the same market. So we have a housing market here for rentals with some sort of supply curve. Supply curve is upward sloping, meaning that, we've got these people who own houses. The higher the price of rentals, the more people will be willing to lease their houses, the more landlords will sell. So there's our law of supply. Renters, a higher quantity of renters would like to rent at a lower price. So we have a downward sloping demand. And then just for reference in this model, suppose we're starting in an initial position with a rental price of 600 and a total quantity of 15,000. Right, so we can study the impact of shifts of supply and demand in the housing market. So a couple of cases that we might want to think about. Here's our initial case, S1 and demand. It could be that supply is somewhat fixed here because it's time consuming to build more housing. We can't do it in the short run or immediately. Landlords might also have alternatives to leasing their housing out, such as Airbnb, which could limit supply even further in the short run. So we've got a potential new supply curve to look at. Suppose the introduction of Airbnb or alternatives to leasing to tenants pop up and it reduces supply. So in this example, we'll analyze these two supply possibilities or these two supply curves, supply 1 and the reduced supply 2, as well as an increasing demand. So again, suppose that no new housing is built, we would have this original S1, but that other opportunities like Airbnb or using your house as a home office pop up. And so 3,000 units are removed from the market, or supply decreases by 3,000 units. What we're showing here. All right, so we get a new equilibrium price and quantity, which is not marked for sure, but it looks like about a price of 650 or so with a quantity of about 13,000. So the question is, right, supply decreased by 3,000 units. Why would we not expect the equilibrium quantity to also decrease by 3,000 units? Right, with our original supply and demand, we had this intersection, the price of 600, quantity of 15,000. We decreased supply by 3,000 units, but the total market quantity only went down to 13,000. So it only fell by about 2,000. All right, so when supply shifted, why did the total equilibrium quantity not decrease by the amount of the supply shift? Why did it not decrease by 3,000? Well, there's a higher price now in the market, and some people are willing and able to pay that higher price, or perhaps in the case of housing, they had to pay that higher price. Right, so although supply decreased by 3,000 units, the total market equilibrium quantity did not decrease by 3,000 units. Instead, some people paid a higher price. All right, what about a demand increase, right? Unlike supply, demand for housing not necessarily fixed. In fact, it could be very quickly growing. We've seen this a lot in Denver, Boulder, other quick growing Colorado cities, even Fort Collins to some extent, rapidly growing. So what happens to a housing market if you have a shock to demand or a large increase in demand? So here we're showing a 9,000 unit increase in the demand curve, which very large shift, I guess, in the short run, but just suppose that this place, I guess, became very popular or something. Everyone wanted to move here, had a huge demand increase. Maybe it's not too unrealistic for a case of Denver or similar places, which have had huge influxes of population lately. So imagine that we have this demand increase of 9,000 units, no new supply, no new housing can be constructed in this time. So we're either on our original supply 1, or we'll also analyze supply 2 with the Airbnbs in. All right, so let's consider two cases. We have the intersection of our new shifted demand and original supply, S1, and the intersection of the new demand, shifted demand 2, and the reduced supply 2. The second one is the one that's actually mapped out on here, but I also wanted to talk briefly about this point right here, S1 and D2, where supply did not shift, but demand did. So with the new demand, D2, at our original supply, what would the market price and quantity have been? Again, they're not marked on here, but it looks about 750 for the price with a quantity down here of 18.5 or 19 or somewhere in there. It's not exact. So how is there a higher quantity now? Right, originally we had this point, price of 600, quantity of 15,000. Now with the shift, original supply, new demand, our market quantity has increased. So how is there a higher market quantity without any new housing? Well, the theory says that at the higher price, some owners who weren't renting before would be willing to become landlords. Right, so we get a higher market quantity due to the fact that more people are willing to supply at the higher price, or in other words, due to our law of supply. We can also look at the intersection of S2 and D2. That's this marked point here, equilibrium price of 800, quantity of 18,000. So, again, asking the question, how is there a higher quantity of rental units without any new ones being built than the original case? Again, we're just going to say that at this price of 800 rather than 600, there are more landlords who are willing to supply their homes to the market. All right, so finally, role of government. Suppose housing prices are really high. Would the government improve the efficiency of the market by intervening, or would they not improve the efficiency of the market? Should the government intervene in housing markets? So suppose we have our shifted supply, we've got our shifted demand. We realize that resulted in a much higher price of rentals. Ultimately, the price of rentals went up from our original $600 to a new equilibrium of $800. That could be a big price increase for people, consumers. So could the government come into this market and say, okay, landlords, you can only charge the original equilibrium price of 600? Would this be a good idea, bad idea? Do we not know? All right, so what would happen if landlords were required to charge a maximum price of 600, but we had this new shifted supply and demand? Well, at this price of 600, we can come out to our demand curve and see that at this price, 600, there are 24,000 people who would like to buy. Demand is 24,000, but supply here at this price on S2 is only 12,000. So we have what's called a shortage here. Demand exceeds supply. By how much? 24,000 minus 12,000. Even if the supply hadn't decreased, if we just look at S1 and demand 2, we would have a shortage at 600. And on S1, there would have been 15,000 people supplying. Oops. Still 24,000 people would want. So even on S1, we would have a shortage of 24 minus 15 or 9,000 units. All right, so the shortage means that some people who want to purchase cannot purchase, they're not available. So in the case of rent controls here, suppose again, in this example, the government wants to limit rental pricing to 600, it's going to create a shortage, and then it's ultimately would fall to the government to provide housing for this unit shortage. All right, so the policy of rent control and low-income subsidized housing could seem sound in theory, but it can also create costs beyond direct government expense. So in order to supply this market shortage created, government usually going to build or purchase blocks of low-income housing. But then these areas tend to become characterized by high density minority populations, low income, limited access to economic opportunities, ultimately crime and other negative stereotypes. So the question is, how can the government intervene in housing markets without if there's rent controls, there's going to be a shortage. If there's a shortage, government must provide the extra housing required. The government does do that. We usually think of these as housing projects, and these housing projects often come with very negative stereotypes or connotations. So again, the question economists face, we might have some problems in our housing market associated with high pricing, shortages of housing, right? If we have a very large housing shortage, we might ultimately end up with homelessness, right? People who want to find homes but can't, or maybe just can't afford homes. This would be sort of an economic shortage situation. And then, of course, again, the question is, does the government step in and provide this shortage of housing? If they do that, how do they do it? Ultimately, historically, it's been to create these low-income housing projects, which just ends up aggregating low-income people into often segregated and sectionalized areas. Right, so the question, how do cities manage growing population, growing demand with limitations on housing supply? We know it takes time to build housing quickly. The demand for housing might change more quickly than the supply does. This could create some shortages of housing, homelessness problems. And so how does the local government, the state government, federal government manage these problems? Right, that's it for this lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.